In today's video, we are going to review the removal and repair process for wheel bearings in the back of a Subaru. This applies to multiple makes and models and even a few select Toyotas. Check the website for specificity. First piece, we're going to remove the rear wheel and then remove the brakes. Brakes are relatively easy. There's two 14mm bolts that need to be removed. You notice one trick Phil uses is actually using a longer wrench than normal since these can become stuck. Longer wrenches and or impact wrenches can make it a little bit easier. Once that's removed, he's going to pull that out of the way and hang that to prevent damage to the line. There are special hooks that you can buy, or a used clothes hanger works equally well. Now we're going to pull that rotor off and gain access to the wheel bearing. Before we do that, we do need to remove the rear wheel speed sensor. In fact, one of the things you'll notice is when these bearings start to go, oftentimes you'll see an error code for either ABS or a speed sensor, and that's because as that piece is moving around, it no longer lines up properly. Removing the rear axle nut, this is a 32mm. You'll notice that Phil is actually using not an air tool, but an electric impact wrench. There's some very good ones out there at a reasonable price point, much easier to use as you don't have to have an air compressor or dragging that cord around. Now we're removing the rear wheel bearing itself. 4 bolts, as you can see here, an extension, a swivel joint, and an impact wrench are your friend, but relatively easy to get at. Once those 4 bolts are removed, we're going to pull out the bearing. Phil realizes that this is not coming out as easily as he had hoped, so he's going to put in what he calls the hub basher. This is a bearing removal tool. You can buy them online for $50 or potentially rent them from an auto part shop. I think many people are surprised in a shop the forces that are used to remove some parts. In this case, you don't have to worry about damaging the vehicle. If these forces were to damage the bearing, the entire bearing assembly is being replaced and you will not damage the vehicle itself. So now that assembly is off, he's going to give it a couple of little taps and the entire bearing assembly will fall out of the carrier. Now, before we move towards reassembly, we always want to clean up mating surfaces. Here he's using a Dremel tool. You can also use steel wool or Scotch-Brite. You want to clean it up and then apply a layer of either anti-seize or assembly lube. In this case, he's using a copper product. Not only does it aid in the assembly, it also prevents corrosion, and that means longer term these will stay more properly aligned. So he's going to put that carrier back on and then slide inside of there the wheel bearing. What's unique about this job is it's actually easier to put back together than to remove. Once you have that bearing in the approximate location, you're going to hand tighten the 4 bolts, and then as you torque those 4 bolts down, it will pull that bearing into the proper location. So work your way around the perimeter of that bearing as you tighten it and torque them to spec, and once complete, that bearing will be, by definition, in the right spot on the vehicle. So there you can see he's using the torque wrench just to make sure he has done this correctly. Install the bolt, the 32mm bolt on the front, put some anti-seize on it. We want to make sure that corrosion does not cause misalignment of that part in the future. And now we're ready to put on the brakes. You can see he's pushing that brake piston back. He's doing it with a wrench. You can do it with a C-clamp. There are specialized tools that do it. You just need to push that piston back far enough that you can reassemble this part. Obviously, if you do need new brake pads, this is an excellent time to do it because there's no additional work required. Just pop in the new pads as it is all disassembled anyway. Installing that rear caliper with the 2 bolts and appropriately torquing it down. In this case, it's about 50 foot-pounds. Once complete, he's going to move again to the outside of the wheel. Actually, before that, we are going to install the wheel sensor, or the speed sensor. Again, he's cleaning up that mating surface to ensure that that sensor sits in exactly the right location as it came out from the factory. So now he's going to tighten down that main axle nut. This is 140 foot-pounds. That's about a 2-foot bore, meaning you're pushing down with about 70 pounds of force. It's a little higher than most people would expect, and you're not going to break anything, but we want to get that good and secure. You can also see he used a secondary lever there to prevent that from rotating while he was tightening it. Final step, putting the tire back on and appropriately torquing the lug nuts. This is a great project for a DIYer that can be done At home in the garage, when you lift that vehicle up, please use proper protocols to make sure that you're not causing risk to yourself. Both the left side and the right side are done exactly the same way. So once you're going to do one, I would suggest doing both sides, and you shouldn't have to touch it for another 150,000 miles. Great job by Phil doing this repair. Have a good day.